Welcome to Chaotic Insights, where I break down the TV show Chaotic. And maybe the TV show isn't the only thing that's chaotic. Today we'll be talking about episode 2 in season 2, Dangers of Diplomacy. So grab a snack, start your laundry, and we'll dive right in. Episode summary: Tom and Kaz are throwing rocks, waiting for Rasmus because they want to scan him. Tara calls and reassures the boys that that is the path that Rasmus would have taken because he is taking a letter to Maxor in Curio City after peace talks with the Danian Queen in Mount Pillar. Then Rasmus crashes his Levitar and his two underworlders, Krek and Ilizar, are chasing him. And so that's not fun. They're attacking Rasmus. Rasmus uses a Song of Stasis music to hold them off, and Tom and Kaz drive Rasmus away with the Levitar. We also learn that a group of Danians is following Rasmus, and they stop at the tar pit for rejuvenation, but the Underworlders return, and the Danians fight them off. We then arrive in Kiru City and learn Maxor and Rasmus have been childhood friends. We get a flashback to their youth, to a time Rasmus taught Maxor that there is more than violence to solve your problems. Then Tom gets a scan of Rasmus and goes to his match. In his match, we learn about Danian parasites, and we see Rasmus transform into a bug-like creature. Tom forfeits the match because he has to warn Maxor right away what he learned. Rasmus then tries to infect Maxor with a parasite, but fails, and he gets chased away. Tom informs Maxor that that was Rasmus, so Maxor lets Rasmus go free. And that's kind of the episode we're working with. So, analysis. This episode is set up in like a really unique way. It's almost like a three-act structure. And so let's talk about it that way. Act 1, Rasmus's journey to Kiru City. It's about 9 minutes of the episode, and that includes the theme song. And what happens in this act, so to speak, is the Underworlders attack Rasmus, and that's like a complication on the journey home. They overcome that, but they return, and the Danians come to solve that problem. And so, like, that conflict of the Underworlders attacking gets resolved. So, in Act 1, we have this, like, mini arc of the conflict with the Underworlders, and that ends up getting resolved. Act 1 closed. Then we have Act 2, which is story time. This takes about 6 minutes of the episode, and Maxor and Rasmus tell the story from their youth. You know, it's interesting we get this like fable-like short story with an explicit lesson thrown in the middle of the episode. And it's actually similar to the Hotan episode where they just tell the story in the middle. But this is different because this is like act 2 of this episode. And so this flashback has its own conflict and resolution and theme, and they like frame this story with, let's sit down next to the fire in the castle, and Maxwell and Rasmus are old friends, and then we like get the scan of Rasmus. So then Act 3 is like the reveal. What does this all mean? And this is about 7 minutes of the episode. So when you look at the breakdown, it's 9, 6, 7. And if you take away the theme song, let's say it's 8, 6, 7, those are all relatively similar in length. Like, it is kind of like a three-act structure. But Tom uses his scan in the new battle and goes to Param and sees that the same thing happened to Rasmus in this Act 3. So, like, this body horror transformation of Rasmus that we get to see in the Drome, that happened in real life. And I would argue that, like, that's the climax of this episode. It's the most interesting and exciting and, like, appalling piece of this episode. I don't know. It is crazy. Like, it's truly crazy. And we get Maxwell coming to terms with this new reality, and that's like the resolution. So, when you think about the plot of this episode, really my instinct is to describe the whole episode's plot with just Act 3. Tom gets a Rasmus scan, discover he's been infected, and then, Rasmus escapes to the overworld. Like, that's the plot to this episode. But that's the plot to Act 3. And so they really build this bigger mystery in order to have a satisfying conclusion and twist. And that's done like through Act 1 and 2. And so Act 1 serves as exposition and foreshadowing. We get that Rasmus is tired and sick, which can be, it could be explained away by the ongoing attack of the Underworlders. He's been beaten down in battle, but it seems to be a deeper issue than that. And we also get this band of Danians following Rasmus, and that's suspicious because, they say, oh, we're following to make sure that you made it to Kiro City all right. Okay, well, if we just had peace relations and you wanted me to travel home safely, you would have sent me with like bodyguards, right? And for Rasmus to not know that he's been followed is odd. It's something to, clue us in that that's unusual, because if it was done in good faith, they would have been traveling with Rasmus rather than in secret behind him. And so that's suspicious. That's weird. So let's move on to Act 2. Act 2 delivers us a more emotional connection to Rasmus. We understand his close relation to Maxor, who we care about, so, a friend of a friend is a friend. And then we get this connection that they display, it gives us the transformation stakes and emotional ramifications. Like when Rasmus transforms, if we didn't know him, it wouldn't mean anything, but because this episode took time and care to show that Maxor cares about him, and we care what Maxor cares about, so now we care about him as an audience, it gives us some level of, you know, satisfaction in the way the plot is built. It helps the catharsis happen. Because if we didn't care about Rasmus, we wouldn't care about Rasmus. So Act 2 builds us caring about him. Plus, we also get the clue that the Song of Resurgence didn't help heal Rasmus, so that could be a clue to what's wrong with him is not energy, it wasn't the battle beforehand. It's something more, something different, something deeper. And then Act 3, we get the reveal. And that's when the twist happens. We get the explanation of what happens, of what a Damian parasite is in the drone battle, but then also what happens in real life. And this is a good example of like show don't tell. They say, what does a Danian parasite do? Well, that's what a Danian parasite does. They never like use their sports commentator knowledge to be like, a Danian parasite transforms a creature into a Danian. No, they don't do that. We see Rasmus transform, and then they go, that's what it does. It's they're showing us, they're not telling us. And that's interesting. That's, writing advice. But what we need to talk about is really the political motivation behind this plan because we get this story about Rasmus and, his youth and his current and his future. We get all these stages of Rasmus. But when you zoom in on that story, it tells us about him. When you zoom out, it really tells us about like the socio-political climate of Param. And we get three tribes highlighted in the story. We have the overworld, a tribe that has been in conflict for so long that they are willing to try something new. The overworlders are taking an earnest step towards peace with the Danians. Now, the Danians, they're still at war, and they're being sneaky. They have this elaborate plan of infecting the overworld ambassador and delivering him to the overworld before he transforms so that Rasmus has the initiative and ability to infect Maxor, right? Really what this is like a fantastical assassination plot. They're trying to take out Maxor by turning him into a Danian. And, you know, the overworld would crumble or, turn into Danian territory or, what? What's the ramifications of that? I don't know, but what they would be is big. And so instead of having two friendly nations who are trying to make peace with each other, the Danians are making one big like annexation of the overworld or trying to colonialize the overworld. Right, they're making war strategy and exercising like political warfare through espionage or through this act. Now onto the Overworlders. They're in the dark on this plan, just like the Overworlders, so they're in a more interesting position. But their reaction to it tells us a lot about the Underworld, right? Kaor sees a peace treaty as a threat. The Overworlders are having such a close alliance with the Danians, right? The Danians live in the Underworld. Mount Pillar helps keep the floor of the overworld up, and the underworlders live underneath it, right? They're in very close proximity, the underworlders and the Danians. So having a ally to their enemy so close, Kaor sees that as a threat. And the Danians, if they have some kind of peace alliance, Kaor sees that as doubling their power, right? They're going toe to toe with the Overworlders. They have mutual respect with the Danians, but if they combine together, that's easily enough power to overpower the Underworld if they so choose. And so Kaor's taking preventative measures by disrupting this treaty because they see it as a threat. They see two people having peace as the potential for them to turn and overtake Kaor. And upon rewatch, we kind of have this case of dramatic irony because I know that the Underworlders and the Danians want the same thing, and that's the downfall of the Overworld. But because the Danians are being sneaky, the Underworlders are fighting the Danians because they think the Danians' plan will strengthen the Overworld, when in reality, the Danians' plans is to undermine the Overworld. So the Danians and Underworlders have very similar motivations here, but they're at conflict because the execution of that is, not being communicated effectively. So all of these characters are really just like the chess pieces in this power grab, in this grab for power. Danians are trying to take power, Underworlders are trying to prevent power from being gained. And the overworld is kind of this victim here, right? They are just trying to be peaceful and honest and create harmony, which, Maxor has two advisors who advocate for peace. He has Rasnus, he has Nadrin. So it makes sense why Maxor, this like kind and fair leader and also warrior, would be open to peace. But, you know, ultimately he gets screwed over. He prevents the power struggle from taking place, but he still loses his like dearest and closest and oldest friend. So the other piece of analysis here is the fable in the middle of the episode, right? The overarching plot is kind of this grand scale socio-political power struggle, but we have this moment where we step away from that and we talk about the past. And we get this fable or this parable in the middle of the episode. And that comes with a pretty explicit theme. And that theme is that there's more than one way to solve a problem. The creature who is down on his luck traps Kiru's city in a force field as revenge for something. And young Maxor's instinct is to beat him up, is to use brute force to force this man to release the city. But it seems like that would have escalated the situation, right? Right now, we have kind of this like captor situation where this, man down on his luck, he's taken over that city. If we're using brute force against him, that might make things worse. And so Rasnus also steps in and he asks questions and he understands this man's motivations and then works to find a solution for the underlying problem. So then he has no need to get revenge on the city as a whole, right? Because Rasnus dismantles his motivation for that. And so the man naturally dismantles his force field because his underlying issues have been addressed. And that is the day that Maxwell learned there's more than one way to get what you want. There's force, which works in some cases, right? He was just playing a sport with Arius, and with that, you need to be aggressive and you need to be firm and strong and use force. So that's a good strategy in playing sports sometimes. But the heart and mind that Rasmus used was an effective strategy here. And so it's about assessing the situation and seeing what tools and resources you actually need to solve the problem. Which to me, this translates real well to real world issues because there are people who respond to dilemmas and their instinct is violence or their instinct is brute force. And quite often that makes things worse. And addressing the underlying issue is not only a good way to address issues, but it's a good way to prevent issues, right? If people's like underlying needs, if their Maslow hierarchy of needs are met, they're less likely to, you know, do crime. For example, if somebody has food, there's no need for them to steal food, right? Because their underlying issue of being hungry is met. In this situation, though, Rasmus feels like a social worker. He feels like he's coming in and he's asking questions and he's addressing the issue, versus it feels like Maxor is playing more like a good cop, bad cop is the situation he wants to do, right? He wants Rasmus to be the good cop and he wants to be the bad cop. And that, escalated the situation and made it worse. So we can kind of extrapolate that this violence is not only not the solution here, but that it applies to situations outside of just this fable. We're supposed to take this lesson and run. And, how can we apply it today? And what occupations and what conflicts might this lesson be useful for? How can we be preventative by addressing underlying issues? And how can we, respond to dilemmas with the opposite of violence? Now, one more piece of this puzzle is that Maxwell is telling this story as a story in the past. He has previously learned this lesson. And so one thing about this story is like they're doing a show note tell thing of like we're seeing the lesson take place in real time as he's telling it. But in like the meta narrative, Maxwell is telling the story. He has already learned this lesson. And I think that contributes to the ways we see him show up in this episode. He, is trying to actively make peace with the Danians. He is being a good and fair leader. And also when Rasmus attacks him, he had the opportunity to go after Rasmus and to, you know, treat him with violence after, you know, Rasmus treated him with violence, but he chooses to turn the other cheek because he said that's not Rasmus. Or that's not the Rasmus I knew anymore. Like he has to go and be with the Danians and figure that out for himself. And that's something that this young Maxor would not have had the wise sage to do, versus this Maxor has already learned this lesson and you know chooses peace. He also makes the comment for something about like you know we as tribes have to learn to trust each other, or you know lest we destroy each other. And this is really giving Cold War vocab term, mutually assured destruction. We're in a political era of param that is, if they were to start a war against each other, it would be mutually assured destruction. And so like that is the main preventative force from accelerating the conflicts between the tribes into something more large scale, right? Because nobody's really going to win at the end of the day if they go into conflict with each other. So that leads to like, why don't we just have peace? We could no longer have like these brief intermittent conflicts if we organize and structure peace in a way like with the Danians, if we reach out to them and, have some sort of established procedure or treaty or whatever. So that's kind of my analysis for the episode. Let's move on to lore. And we do get some lore in this episode. The Song of Stasis is only permanent when cast on one opponent. It's only temporary when you cast it on two. That's interesting, and I wonder if that's applicable to other music, right? When you cast a music on just one creature, it's stronger than if you cast it on a broad net. Another piece of lore we get is Rasmus has been the Danian ambassador for many Solans and has been unsuccessful until recently. And so this tells us a little bit about the overworld governmental system. We can assume that each tribe has an ambassador in the overworld, and that, whether they are successful or not at their positions, the overworld is trying to create peace in Param. We also learn about some more things about the overworld governmental system. Specifically in this flashback, we learn that Maxor's father was the leader of the overworld, which kind of implies a monarchy. So far, they've been ambiguous with the governmental system of the overworld. Is Maxor, a democratically elected leader? And this kind of points to no. Like, it's possible that both Maxor and his dad were elected into this position, but like, typically that's unusual. And so it kind of allows us to infer that there's some sort of monarchy or chain of command in the overworld. Unless, I don't know, unless nepotism happened. But also, Rasmus and Maxor, Rasmus being the Danian ambassador, is that nepotism? Because Maxor is Rasmus's childhood friend. And so is that unfair, or is that just an effective marketing tool? And, you know, Maxor is using his network of people and knows that Rasmus is good with peace and allowing him to use his skills to his benefit. Who's to say? Other lore we get, it looks like Arius was also a childhood friend. He's the one playing this sport, this sort of football or rugby situation. And this time he's wearing the right outfit. Hooray! Yay for animation change. But sports, this is something that we haven't really explored in this world. Like, what do creatures do for leisure is a question that kind of goes unanswered in the first season. We do get that moment in the Hotan episode where, the kids are like throwing frisbee around. But there is, a specifically shaped ball for this specific game. That's, rugby or football in nature, American football that is. And, it gives us insight into kids being kids. They're playing this game, they're having fun. And it, kind of mirrors what we have in American society with football. They're running around throwing a ball, playing catch, doing a little more than that. They're having fun. We also get some info about the Gurgith Springs and how these tar pits are famous for their healing properties. And of course, the big piece of lore from this episode are the Danian parasites. So, a Danian parasite, we learn, is like a bug that goes in a creature and it genetically alters the creature into a Danian bug-like creature, which is one, horrifying, and two, raises questions. So we see Maxor successfully deflect the Danian parasite from infecting him, and so we learn that they have like a weakness to fire. The parasite like goes on his face and then Maxor burns it up. But I'm thinking like Stelgar or other Momark creatures have malleable allegiance, and that like tribe is fluid. Stelgar was created as an overworlder and then like went down to the underworld and now is famously an underworlder. And so the concept of Danian parasites aligns with that like, your tribe allegiance is fluid, but it also plays with like it's not the parasite's not really a mind control situation. It's like a genetic weapon. It genetically alters you, and you hatch into this new creature, which again is horrifying. And it also kind of implies that the Danians are an ethno state, because in order to be a Danian, you have to look like a Danian, which that has like its own implications. And I also have the question, right after Rasmus transforms into Bug Rasmus, he immediately understands the Overworlders are the enemy and that the plan was to infect Maxor. And so he must be connected through Hive to get that information or to get those signals or to get the cultural context around like now he's a Damian. But you would think that Rasmus would have some semblance of his old memories, and like he doesn't like regretfully and scornfully join the Danians. He is like in it. He doesn't remember him old self. He doesn't even acknowledge that he like knows Maxor, and that's not the Rasmus that Maxor knew. And so we can kind of guess that this Danian parasite is a full transformation in body and mind and allegiance and personality, and that what makes a Danian is partially their contribution to the hive. And so it's really an interesting concept because one, horrifying, and two, again, it plays with the socio-political ramifications of this world. On to fun facts and other notes. Something that I wrote down is new guitar opening arpeggios. And in the opening of this episode, I think we get some new underscoring because, when you watch this show, you come to understand the way it's underscored. And I love the way it's underscored. But there's some common themes. And I was like, this just isn't one that I think I've heard before. And so, new theme just dropped. Something I've also been noticing with season two is it feels like there's kind of this distinctive shift in the creatures they're trying to highlight. Like they're trying to incorporate cards from newer packs, whether that's Zenith of the Hive or Silent Sands or after that. Like Ilizar is with Krek, and so we have one creature we know, and so Krek brings the context of this is an underwater, and that's bad news. And Ilizar is a new creature, one you don't recognize, and so pairing the old with the new helps you get that immediate recognition if this is an underwater. But also like Rasnus. Rasnus is an overworlder, and then he turns into a Xanian, and like the Levitar card and the concept of a parasite all kind of come with these newer card packs. And so you can kind of feel that like distinctive shift of like, okay, it's time to highlight these new creatures as a marketing tool to help sell these cards and explain away these like oncoming storylines that we get through the cards. These first two episodes are very Param focused, especially this episode. The emotional weight of this episode falls on Rasnus and Maxor, not Tom or the humans. Like, we see Rasnus go through this change, literally, like we see him, the emotional and physical change of being infected by a parasite. And we see Maxor having to deal with the ramifications of that, having his oldest and closest friends no longer recognize him, and there's like a weight to that. But also, something I've noticed is what is them not giving Drome opponents code names in these first two episodes? I need them for my chart. These first two episodes, we get some chaotic matches, but they don't like say the code names of the human opponents. Those really aren't the focus of the episode, but I always think it's fun when they add them in because, I feel like it helps add flavor to the world. Now, one thing I do have to talk about is Como assimilated, and he gets a cameo in this episode. And this feels so crazy because either I didn't see this before or I didn't remember that I saw this before, but I felt so crazy. I was like, that's him. In the band of Damians that follows Rasnus, one of them is the Como assimilated creature. And that does give us like a definitive answer on what happened in what episode 37 of the Danian Queen infected the Mopedian intruder in the previous animation style. And now we see him here, that's a Danian. And it's little details like this that, I'm still discovering that make me love Chaotic. And I think that's really cool. But also, this episode is the perfect time to talk about the assimilated cards because in the packs, we have Como and we have Como assimilated, or we have Rasnus and then we have Rasnus assimilated. And one thing I love about these cards is, the storytelling that happens in the cards that parallels the TV show, right? The synergy of telling this story is strong. And so what I love about these cards is how the composition stays the same, right? They're keeping the same composition, and that, gives you a shorthand to compare them. And I think that's really clever in terms of art and design. And like the original next to the bugified version of these characters, I think is so clever and neat. And I feel like one of the things that I could appreciate as a kid watching the series and getting those cards. So, really, my final thoughts on this episode are I think this episode is really iconic. It really sticks in your mind, especially with the whole like Rasmus transformation body horror sequence. Like that sticks with you. And, surprisingly, underneath all of this, episode about Rasmus, it gives us a lot of insight on the political state of Param, which, I love. And I think that's really what I find interesting about the TV show of Chaotic is this deep and interesting world that they've created. And I don't know, I think this, season two right now, we had two pretty good episodes in a row. And so I wonder if they're going to keep on this trend. If you have anything I missed, any comments, I'd love to hear them. And with that, thank you for watching. This is a cool episode. And I'll see you next time. Bye.